Okay, let's dive into this. The Klondike Gold Rush. Picture this. Around 100,000 people decide to chase gold. But, and this is staggering, only about 30, maybe 40,000 actually get there, to the Klondike region in the Yukon between 1896 and 1899.
Yeah, that drop off, it just hits you immediately, doesn't it? It tells you everything about the sheer scale of the challenge.
Totally. It's like a filter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This wasn't some weekend trip. It was a huge migration, all sparked by finding gold on August 16th, 1896, along Bonanza Creek. That difference in numbers really underscores the brutal reality waiting for them.
Absolutely. And when the news finally hit Seattle and San Francisco in 97,
Yeah.
it wasn't a trickle. It was like a floodgate opening.
An explosion. Pure excitement.
So for you listening, we're not just going to list dates and names. We want to get into the human side of it all, the insane obstacles, the stories that sound almost made up, and how this whole rush left its mark, even on people who came back with empty pockets.
Right. Because if you zoom out, it's this incredible story of human drive, ambition crashing headfirst into this incredibly harsh landscape. Gold was the spark, sure. But the journeys themselves, the towns that popped up and then vanished, wow, they tell us so much about people, about history. So our mission really is to unpack our sources, look at that first discovery, those routes. Oh man, those routes.
Yeah.
Life in the boom towns, what mining was actually like, and how it all fizzled out. We want to pull out the really gripping stuff for you.
Okay, let's start with the spark then. August 1896, Bonanza Creek. The sources mention George Carmack, Skookum Jim, Tagish Charlie. Sounds straightforward enough. 3 guys find gold.
Well, yes and no.
Yeah.
It gets a bit murky, actually, because while Carmack usually gets the official credit, there's this background story, an apparent agreement among them, that he should be presented as the discoverer. And the likely reason, well, it shines a pretty harsh light on the time. The fear was, apparently, that a claim made by indigenous prospectors Skookum Jim and Tagish Charlie were Tagish just wouldn't be recognized by the authorities.
Wow. Okay, so right from the start, it's tangled up in prejudice and power.
Exactly. It wasn't just about who found the gold, but who was allowed to claim it,
Yeah.
In the eyes of the government, of society.
That adds a whole other dimension. And it wasn't just a few flakes, right? The sources say it was a serious amount of gold.
Oh, yeah, incredibly rich. I mean, Carmack staked several claims right away, which tells you something. And then, almost immediately, even richer finds were made on Eldorado Creek, a tributary nearby.
Eldorado Creek, perfect name.
It really lived up to it for a lucky few, definitely.
So the gold's there. But how does this news from this pretty remote spot suddenly set the world on fire? News didn't exactly travel instantly back then.
No, it took time. The real catalyst was June 1897. Ships like the Excelsior in San Francisco and then the Portland and Seattle docked carrying fortunes in Klondike gold.
Literal boatloads.
Literally. Initial reports said over $1 million worth, but it was probably way more. Seeing that, the physical gold coming off the ships, that's what created the frenzy. It wasn't just a rumor anymore.
I can just picture it. Crowds on the docks. Well, it must have been electric. And the timing was crucial too, wasn't it? The 1890s had seen recessions, bank failures.
Precisely. People were hurting economically. They were desperate for hope, for a chance. The gold standard was still in effect, so gold was wealth.
Right.
One of the Klondike seemed like this lifeline, a chance to escape debt, maybe even get truly rich. It tapped into something really deep.
It was the ultimate gamble, maybe, but the entry fee was just enduring hell, basically.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And there's that interesting psychological angle. The sources mentioned that Klondike was just far enough away to be romantic and just close enough to be accessible.
That's a great line. Close enough to try, far enough to dream about.
Yeah. And that perception, combined with some very savvy publicity, especially from Seattle, a newspaperman there, Erastus Brainerd, really pushed Seattle as the gateway.
Boosting the hometown.
Oh, absolutely. They basically marketed the rush, steering people towards routes that started in Seattle, which, massively benefited the city's businesses.
Makes sense. Which brings us neatly to those treacherous routes. Because getting there, that was the first huge filter. The main ways were through Dia or Skagway in Alaska, leading to either the Chilkoot or the White Pass Trail. Neither sounds pleasant.
Pleasant is not the word. And here's the kicker. The Canadian government required everyone entering the Yukon to bring a year's supply of food.
A year's supply. How much is that?
About 1,150 pounds. Over half a ton. Just food. Add tools, tents, clothes, everything else. You're talking close to a ton of gear per person.
A ton? How on earth?
They had to move it in stages, relay it bit by bit, over mountains, through freezing cold, rain, mud. It's mind-boggling. And get this, most people who actually made it didn't arrive until the summer of 1898, nearly 2 years after the gold was found.
2 years, just incredible perseverance. Let's break down those passes. White Pass, starting from Skagway. The source calls it the Dead Horse Trail. That says it all, really.
It's grim. It apparently started okay, but quickly turned into this nightmare of narrow ledges, huge boulders, sharp rocks.
Okay.
Thousands of pack horses died on that trail, just collapsed from exhaustion, injury, starvation. Jack London wrote about it, horrifying descriptions. Rain turned it into this deep, sucking mud pit. It actually became impassable for a while, and in late 97, trapping thousands.
Trapped, just stuck there.
Yeah. Even after they built a toll road, hauling that ton of supplies over it, it was still just back-breaking, relentless work.
Okay, so White Pass sounds awful. What about Chilkoot Pass from Daya? Higher, apparently even more popular.
Yeah, something like 22,000 people went over the Chilkoot. It was shorter, but steeper, way steeper. There was this spot called the Scales near the summit, where the Mounties weighed everyone's gear to make sure they had the required year's supply.
So you couldn't cheat the system?
Nope. And then came the final ascent. A 1,000-foot climb up this incredibly steep slope, often covered in ice and snow. People had to haul their ton of gear up that, maybe 50 pounds at a time.
Over and over again.
Dozens of trips up and down the same slope. Packers were available. Many skilled Tlingit or Tagish men knew the route well, but they charged huge fees.
Of course, supply and demand.
And it was dangerous. There was a massive avalanche on April 3rd, 1898. Killed over 60 people, just swept off the pass.
Oh, that's terrible. Just adds another layer of risk.
It really does. But you also saw ingenuity. People carved steps into the ice, the golden steps.
Right.
And entrepreneurs built these tramways, some simple rope systems, others powered by horses or even steam engines later on to haul gear up for a price.
Trying to make the impossible slightly less impossible.
For those who could afford it, yeah. It definitely changed things, but it was still an immense struggle.
What about other ways? The source mentions an all-water route. Sounds easier.
The rich man's route, they called it. It involved a long sea voyage from Seattle around Alaska to the mouth of the Yukon River at St. Michael, then taking a riverboat thousands of miles upstream to Dawson.
That sounds long.
Incredibly long.
Yeah.
4,700 miles. And expensive. Plus, it had its own dangers. In 1897, the Yukon froze over much earlier than expected.
Oh, no.
Yeah, thousands of stampeders got trapped on their riverboats, stuck in the ice hundreds of miles from Dawson, facing winter with low supplies. Many didn't make it until the next summer or worse, so no easy way in.
No easy way at all. And there were even other routes. Dalton Trail, Stikine, All-Canadian, even one called the All-American route from Valdez.
People tried everything.
Yeah.
The All-Canadian routes were an attempt to stay entirely within Canada, often starting from Edmonton or Ashcroft, but they were incredibly long and difficult overland journeys.
And the Valdez one, the source calls it disastrous.
Utterly disastrous. Promoters claimed it was an easy overland route from Valdez, Alaska. The reality involved crossing the massive, dangerous Valdez Glacier.
A glacier?
Yeah. It was madness. People got trapped, suffered terribly from exposure, malnutrition, scurvy. One big group reportedly turned back with only a handful of survivors. It just shows the desperation and maybe the naivety fueled by gold fever.
Okay, so against all odds, let's say you survive the journey, you finally stumble into the Klondike. What was life actually like in these boom towns? Dawson City's the big one, right?
Dawson was the epicenter. It went from like a few cabins and maybe 500 people in 1896 to a packed town of around 17,000 by the summer of 98. Just explosive growth. But imagine trying to build a city that fast, that far north.
Chaos.
Total chaos. Ramshackle wooden buildings thrown up overnight. No real sanitation, isolation, freezing winters, constant risk of fire sweeping through the town, outbreaks of typhoid, dysentery, and prices for everything were sky high.
Sounds miserable.
For many, it was. Yet, at the same time, you had the lucky few who'd struck gold, living it up in the saloon, spending fortunes like water. It was this bizarre mix of extreme hardship and sudden, extravagant wealth.
That contrast again. And we have to remember the original inhabitants, the Han people. Their lives were completely overturned by this influx, weren't they?
Devastated, really. They were forced off their traditional lands at the river confluence where Dawson sprang up, moved on to a reserve. Their fishing and hunting grounds were disrupted, and they were hit incredibly hard by diseases the newcomers brought. It's a tragic part of this story that often gets overlooked.
Definitely. Now, compare Dawson to Skagway back at the start of the trails. The source paints Skagway as much more Wild West.
Yeah.
lawless.
Yeah, Skagway was different. It was initially under U.S. control, and it just didn't have that strong police presence like Dawson had with the Canadian Northwest Mounted Police, the NWMP. So Skagway quickly got a reputation. Lots of drinking, gambling, shootouts, prostitution. And it was famously dominated for a while by this criminal boss, Soapy Smith, and his gang.
Soapy Smith. Sounds like a character.
Oh, he was. Ran scams, controlled illicit businesses until he was killed in a shootout. So yeah, Skagway was rough, while Dawson, despite its chaos, was relatively more orderly thanks to the Mounties.
Interesting how governance made such a difference. And the rush didn't just create Dawson Skagway, right? Other places popped up.
Absolutely. Daya, the start of the Chilkoot Trail, boomed for a while. Wrangell, Valdez served as ports, and cities far away, like Seattle and San Francisco, saw huge economic benefits from supplying the stampeders. The ripple effect was enormous.
Right. Okay, let's get into the actual mining. The realities of mining. You've staked a claim. How did that even work?
Well, first you needed a license from the Canadian government. Then you had to physically stake out your claim along a creek. They had specific size limits, usually 500 feet along the creek bed.
Right.
And you had to pay annual fees to keep it, plus a royalty, a percentage of any gold you found to the government.
Okay, bureaucratic hurdles too.
Oh, yeah. And claims themselves became commodities. People bought and sold them constantly. Prices could go from almost nothing to a fortune overnight if someone hit a rich patch nearby. There's that story of the lucky Swede.
Right, claim 8 on El Dorado.
Exactly. Apparently bought it while drunk for a song, and it turned out to be incredibly rich. Pure luck, or maybe legend, but it captures the vibe.
So it wasn't just hammering rocks. It involved paperwork and speculation too. But the physical work. How did they get gold out of the ground? Especially with that permafrost.
Yeah, the permafrost was the killer app, so to speak. The ground was frozen solid year-round, just a few feet below the surface, so you couldn't just dig easily.
So how'd they do it?
The main method, incredibly, was building huge wood fires on the ground. Let it burn for hours to thaw maybe a foot of gravel underneath. Shovel that out, build another fire, repeat.
Slow, dangerous, and smoky, I bet.
Incredibly slow and smoky. Later, some started using steam points, pipes forcing steam into the ground to thaw it faster. But that needed equipment, fuel. It wasn't common during the main rush.
Okay, so you finally get a pile of thawed-out gravel. Then what?
Then you had to wait for summer for running water. The main technique was sluicing. You build these long wooden troughs, sluice boxes, with ridges called riffles on the bottom.
Okay.
You shovel the gravel in, run creek water through it. The water washes away the lighter sand and gravel, but the heavier gold particles get trapped behind the riffles.
Makes sense. Like panning, but bigger scale.
Exactly. Panning was used for testing or cleaning up the concentrates from the sluice box. For gold found higher up on hillsides, away from easy water access bench gold, they used rockers. Kind of like wooden cradles you'd rock back and forth with water and gravel inside to separate the gold.
Sounds like relentless hard work.
It was, and it required time, the right location, capital for supplies, and maybe labor. It wasn't easy money, despite the hype.
Which brings us to the odds of success. The source is pretty blunt about this. Most people found nothing, right?
That's the hard truth. Of the 40,000 who reached Dawson, maybe only half, 20,000, even became prospectors. Many arrived too late, or couldn't afford gear, or took other jobs.
Okay.
And of those who actually prospected, maybe only 4,000 found any significant amount of gold. And the number who became truly wealthy, very, very small. A few hundred, perhaps.
So the image of everyone striking it rich is just a myth?
Largely, yes. By the time the main wave of stampeders arrived in '98, the best ground on the richest creeks, Bonanza, El Dorado, was already staked.
Yeah.
Often by the people who were there before the rush really began. It's a classic story of boom and bust realities.
It really puts the whole thing in perspective. Now, we mentioned the NWMP maintaining order in Dawson. Let's touch more on law and order and governance. They seem pretty key to the Canadian side of the story.
They really were. The Northwest Mounted Police established posts at the passes and along the river, enforcing Canadian law right from the start. They were generally seen as disciplined, professional, and, importantly, less corruptible than some of the U.S. officials the miners encountered first.
What kind of things were they enforcing?
Well, that crucial year's supply rule, for starters. They checked for illegal weapons. They collected customs duties on goods brought into Canada, which was a constant source of grumbling from the American prospectors, naturally.
I bet. Taxes are never popular.
Especially when you've just hauled a ton of gear over Mountain Pass. But overall, their presence prevented the kind of widespread lawlessness seen in Skagway.
But the source mentions some early problems with the civilian government, too. It wasn't all smooth sailing.
No, initially there were complaints about inefficiency, maybe some corruption among the appointed officials running the territory. But things apparently improved significantly when William Ogilvie, a respected surveyor who knew the area well, took over as commissioner. He implemented reforms that made the administration more stable.
Right, getting the systems in place. Now, in such a remote place, how did people get news? News and communication must have been a huge deal.
Oh, absolutely. People were starved for information from the outside world. Any scrap of news, even months old, was devoured.
I can imagine.
The arrival of the first printing presses in Dawson was a major event. You had newspapers like the Klondike Nugget and the Midnight Sun literally racing each other to publish first. They became incredibly important, even if the news was dated.
And mail. Getting letters in and out.
Initially, it was chaos.
Yeah.
Very slow, unreliable. Mail might take months. But the NWMP helped organize it, and eventually a more formal postal service was established, improving things somewhat. Still, communication was a constant challenge.
Being so cut off adds another layer of hardship, doesn't it? What about the women in the Klondike? We know they were there, but the role of women. The source says it was diverse.
It really was. Numerically, women were a small minority, maybe only a few percent of the population in the early rush, but their roles varied widely.
Yeah.
You had wives and daughters who came with prospecting husbands and fathers, facing all the domestic challenges of that harsh environment, which was incredibly tough work in itself.
Setting up a home there. Unimaginable.
Then you had single women seeking opportunity. Some became incredibly successful entrepreneurs. Belinda Maroney is famous, started with almost nothing, built hotels, businesses, made a fortune. Martha Black is another who arrived and later became a prominent figure, even an MP.
Wow. So real business women carving out a niche.
Definitely. And then inevitably in the boomtown environment like that, you also had women working in entertainment dancers, singers, and in the sex trade. Saloons and dance halls were a big part of Dawson life.
And the source mentions social divisions.
Yes, there were pretty clear lines drawn between, say, married respectable women, business women, entertainers, and sex workers, and also, crucially, between white women and indigenous women, whose interactions and status were shaped by the prevailing colonial attitudes.
A complex social picture, then, not just a mass of male miners. So this intense period, it had to end. What caused the end of the rush?
It wasn't one single thing, more combination starting around 1898, maybe into 99. A big factor was simply reality setting in. Most people weren't finding gold. It was incredibly hard to make a living. Many just gave up and left.
The dream died.
For many, yes. Also, the world's attention shifted. The Spanish-American War broke out in 1898, and newspapers suddenly had a new, bigger story to cover. Klondike headlines faded.
The news cycle moved on.
Exactly. Dawson itself was also changing, becoming more settled, more civilized perhaps, losing some of that wild frontier excitement. But the killer blow, really.
What was that?
Gold was discovered in Nome, Alaska, on the coast in 1898 and 99. And it was supposedly easier to get to, easier to mine beach gold, some of it.
And a new shiny object?
Precisely. That triggered a massive exodus from the Klondike to Nome. Thousands packed up and headed out, chasing the next big strike. And just like that, the Klondike Rush was essentially over.
Wow, so fast. So what's the lasting legacy of this whole whirlwind?
It's pretty broad, actually. On the personal level, you have the stories of the individuals. What happened to Carmack, Skookum Jim, Harshest Charlie. Mixed fortunes, really. Some held on to wealth, others lost it. And you get these enduring legends like Klondike Kate, who wasn't actually one person, but kind of a composite figure based on a couple of different entertainers, Kathleen Rockwell and Catherine Ryan. The myth-making started almost immediately.
And the legacy for indigenous peoples. We touched on the hen.
Yeah, and that legacy is overwhelmingly negative and profound. The Tlingit Packers and Koyukon guides maybe saw some short-term economic gain, but for the Han, whose homeland was the Klondike, it was catastrophic.
Right.
Environmental damage to fish and game stocks, devastating population decline from imported diseases like smallpox and influenza, the forced relocation. The impacts were severe and long-lasting.
That's crucial to remember. What about the places themselves?
Well, Dawson City declined rapidly after the rush, though it never completely disappeared. Daya essentially vanished once the Chilkoot Pass route faded.
Yeah.
Skagway, interestingly, survived and leans heavily on its gold rush history for tourism today. And you have official recognitions now, like the Klondike Gold Rush National Historical Park, spanning areas in Alaska and Washington State, and the Klondike World Heritage Site in the Yukon, recognizing both the Gold Rush history and the Han heritage.
Preserving that history. And culturally, the Klondike seems larger than life in our imagination.
Oh, hugely. It's embedded in North American culture. Think of Jack London's stories, Call of the Wild, White Fang directly inspired by his time there, Robert Service's poems, The Cremation of Sam McGee.
Classic.
Pierre Berton's a fantastic history book, Klondike. The amazing photographs by people like Eric Hegg, which gave the world those iconic images of miners climbing the Chilkoot, even Charlie Chaplin's film, The Gold Rush.
Right, that image of him eating his boot.
Exactly. And the language terms like chichaco for a newcomer, sourdough for a veteran, they come directly from the Klondike. The whole event just captured the imagination and created this enduring myth.
So wrapping this up, it really was so much more than just digging for gold, wasn't it?
Absolutely. It was this incredible, intense burst of human activity against insane odds. Boom towns appearing from nowhere. Fortunes made and lost overnight. Massive environmental and social upheaval.
A microcosm of ambition, hardship, luck, and loss.
Perfectly put. It left this indelible mark on the North, on the people involved, and on our collective idea of adventure and the pursuit of dreams.
So here's something to maybe mull over as we finish. When you think about the Klondike Gold Rush, do you see it mainly as thousands of individual stories, people betting everything on a personal quest for riches? Or was it more of a mass movement driven by bigger forces like economic depression and maybe just that human pull towards the unknown, the frontier?
That's a great question. Individual ambition versus societal waves.
Yeah. How did this short, dramatic episode shape how we think about opportunity, about risk, about what people will endure for a chance at a different life? Maybe exploring some of those photos or reading the stories from the time could give you an even richer sense of what it was truly like.